Good evening. Well, this is different because Gary's gone and Michael is sick, and me and Don don't know how to set up the other camera. So we've got the cameras in their normal position so that I can say hi to my mother. Hi, Mom. And my wife. Hi, Tracy. And that way we can stay true to that arrangement of being able to be on the camera, but don't let the fact that I'm standing up here lull you into the sense of not being able to participate or make comments and things of that nature, because it'll be much more interesting if I hear feedback from you and you're able to participate and you don't just stand here and listen to me for the next 50 minutes or so. So we are continuing in Luke, and I learned don't doubt Gary, don't rise to the bait when he says he doesn't think we'll finish tonight, because there's only 2 chapters left, but they're 2 kind of long chapters, and they're 2 very important chapters. So chapters 23 and 24 are the last 2 chapters of Luke. If we finish tonight, great. We'll start Acts next week. If we don't finish tonight, great. We'll finish Luke next week, and then we'll start Acts after that. So we are not necessarily just trying to push through the last 2 chapters, but we want to cover them well, especially considering the subject matter that we'll find in the 2 chapters for tonight. So, with that said, I'm not usually the one that pushes this button, so I got to make sure I know how to use it. So we'll start with Luke 23. In verses 1 through 5, if you remember last week at the end of chapter 22, we read about the Last Supper in the upper room, and then Jesus went with his disciples out to the garden, and he was praying there, and Judas led the soldiers into the garden, and there was that confrontation in the garden, and then Jesus was arrested, and we had the story of Peter denying Jesus as Jesus was there at the house of the high priest and in the courtyard and those things. So we pick up the story there after daybreak, which is kind of how it ends at the end of chapter 22, when the formal real trial can begin, because now we're finally at daybreak. And so we'll pick up chapter 23 there, verses 1 through 5, have Jesus before Pilate. It says, "So the whole body of them arose and brought him before Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, 'We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king.' And Pilate asked him, saying, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' And he answered him and said, 'It is as you say.' And Pilate said to the chief priests and the multitudes, 'I find no guilt in this man.' But they kept on insisting, saying, 'He stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee, even as far as this place.'" So he's taken before Pilate, and it says there in verse 1, it says the whole body of them, that is the Sanhedrin, that's the Jewish council, that's the ruling, governing body of the Jewish nation. And so they arise together as a body to take Jesus before Pilate. Now, does that mean that all of the Sanhedrin was in favor of this trial, or was in favor of passing judgment on Jesus in this way? The ones who were there, and it's a sort of a democratic organization. I mean, if the majority of them had felt this way, or majority of them felt this way, then they could overrule those ones that were speaking out. And later, if we make it into the last chapter, we'll find that at least one of them was speaking out against this. Chuck? Right. Right. They are going to press issues that they believe will advance their cause. And so they know that if they can get, Pilate is a Roman official, so if they can in some way accuse Jesus of something that is in opposition to the Roman government, that puts Pilate in the position of having to defend his Caesar, having to defend his king. And so they, of course, are going to bring up those charges that would best promote their cause. But had Jesus ever said to withhold taxes against Caesar? No. In fact, he said the opposite. See that coin? It's got Caesar's face on it. It must belong to him. So Jesus does not teach about withholding taxes to Caesar. He's not necessarily pro-Roman government. He's not necessarily a big Roman government supporter, but he's not an agitator against the Roman government. So they are mischaracterizing and misleading at best the things and the positions that Jesus had taken. Now, just before Pilate shows himself to be a very astute politician before it's over. And you're exactly right. We'll see that here in just a moment. So they do say that Jesus is promoting himself as king. Now, had he promoted himself as a king? Well, yeah, but not in the sense that they are accusing him of, not in the sense of wanting to overthrow the Roman government and usurp Caesar's authority. Jesus was a king regardless of who sat on the Roman throne. Jesus was a king regardless of whether there is a Caesar or not a Caesar. Jesus' kingship does not have anything to do with Caesar. And so, because his is a spiritual kingdom. And so it does not concern itself with earthly kingdoms in that sense. Yeah. Right. Yeah, and so he doesn't, he's not trying to overthrow Caesar, but that certainly is what they're trying to make it look like he's trying to do. So Jesus' response, I think we talked about this maybe last week when somebody asked, are you a king? Or they said something about who Jesus is, and he says, you have said it. It is as you say. He doesn't deny it. He doesn't elaborate on it. He doesn't offer any evidence one way or the other. He just confirms it is as you say. And he has given all the evidence at this point that he needs to give. Jesus has established who he is. At this point, he doesn't need to defend himself to Pilate because Jesus has spent the last 3 years defending who he is. He has established who he is. And that's why he's here today. That's why he's in front of Pilate now. So how does Pilate respond? What does Pilate pronounce him? He's not guilty. He's done nothing deserving of death. Even Pilate, who is, at best, Pilate is a disinterested observer, but at worst, Pilate wants to keep the peace. He wants to, he's going to show that he's willing to sacrifice an innocent man in order to keep the peace. But even at this point, Pilate's standing up and saying, you've not made your case. You have not proven him to be a traitor. You've not proven him worthy of anything resembling guilt. So he pronounces him not guilty, but then the crowd stirs up the people. That is, the leaders stir up the people, the Sanhedrin. Well, they're going to do that later, but they're claiming that Jesus stirs up the people. Has Jesus incited riots? No. Jesus, now, think of the triumphal entry into Jerusalem when the people are crying out, Hosanna to the King, and the religious leaders are saying, tell them to be quiet. And Jesus says, no. Well, but that still was not violence. It was not a riot. They were proclaiming him as the Son of David. They weren't stirring up trouble in the sense that the religious leaders here are saying that he was. So they have completely oversold their case. They've completely manufactured charges against Jesus. They're misrepresenting the facts of the case. They're doing whatever they have to do to try to convince Pilate that Jesus is guilty. Verses 6 through 12 says, but when Pilate heard it, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. When he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was in Jerusalem at that time. Now Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he had wanted to see him for a long time because he had been hearing about him and was hoping to see some sign performed by him. And he questioned him at some length, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there accusing him vehemently. And Herod with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. Now Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that very day, for before they had been at enmity with one another. So Pilate hears that Jesus is a Galilean, whether he hears it in his voice, whether he hears facts of the case and finds out that Jesus is from that region, whatever it is. And he says, oh, wait a minute. Galilee is out of my jurisdiction. That's under the jurisdiction of a man named Herod. Get him out of here. So send Jesus to Herod. It's his problem, not mine. So he sends him to Herod, and Herod at first is excited. He wants to see Jesus because he's heard about this man, and he assumes that he's going to get to see some miracle or some cool trick that maybe Jesus can do for him to show him something special. But how does Jesus respond when he's before Herod? He doesn't reply. He doesn't answer him anything. Again, Jesus at this point has established who he is. He doesn't owe Pilate a defense. He doesn't owe Herod a defense. Jesus is who he is. He has established that over and over and over again. He doesn't have to prove it anymore. So he answers him nothing, and then Herod turns on him. If you can imagine, Herod is excited to see Jesus, thinks that Jesus probably will do anything to get out of the mess that he's in, but when Jesus answers nothing, Herod turns on him. Sure, yes, absolutely. He stands as the sheep before the shear is dumb. He absolutely is fulfilling the scripture of Isaiah and other places where he is not going to answer his accusers. It reminds me of there's a proverb. I think it's Proverbs either 25 or 26 where there are two verses back to back. One verse says, "Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes," and then the very next verse says, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, yes, lest you be like him." So Jesus at times would stand up to his accusers, would stand up to the people who were challenging him, and he would put them in their place. Jesus could have silenced this whole thing right here. At any point that he wanted to, he could have silenced every one of his accusers. But in this case, he had the wisdom to remain silent because he did. He wanted to be impressed, and he figured that Jesus would owe him something. If I get Jesus out of this mess and he really can do some of the stuff that people are saying he's doing, I've got him in my back pocket. I can own him. And so Herod is not motivated by anything resembling righteousness here. Herod is motivated by greed. He is motivated by power. And when Jesus refuses to perform on command, Herod turns on him. And we see that in the passage where it says that in verse 11, Herod with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe. Herod absolutely is the ringleader of the mocking. And just imagine the petulance of an immature boy who is now a king, who has the power to humiliate his prisoner. And that's exactly what Herod shows himself to be here. So the priests and the scribes are accusing Jesus. He doesn't answer anything. He doesn't stand up to the charges. He is treated with contempt. They dress him in a robe and they send him back. Herod and Pilate become friends at this point. They had been enemies. If you can imagine somebody not liking Herod after the way that he's demonstrated himself to act here. But Pilate and Herod become friends after this point. And it's a political alliance, to be sure. Verses 13 to 17. And Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers of the people and said to them, "You brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion. And behold, having examined him before you, I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you make against him. No, nor has Herod, for he sent him back to us. And behold, nothing deserving death has been done by him. I will therefore punish him and release him." Now he was obliged to release to them at the feast one prisoner. So again, Pilate, he's been returned to Pilate. The fact that Herod has returned Jesus to Pilate and not pronounced judgment on him and not pronounced a sentence against him demonstrates that Herod has found no guilt in him worthy of punishment. He returns him to Pilate. Pilate examines him one more time, and he finds no evidence of any wrongdoing that's deserving of punishment, so he pronounces him not guilty. And then Pilate, notice the way Pilate words his pronouncement. He says, "I will therefore punish him and release him." That's his judgment. That's his decision. Pilate has rendered his verdict. And Pilate speaks with the authority of Caesar. He is Caesar's representative in the region. And when Pilate speaks, what he says carries the weight of an edict from Caesar. And he is not used to being challenged. He is not used to somebody standing up to him and saying, "No, we don't accept your verdict." But that's exactly what they do. And while on one hand we see the political astuteness of Pilate by the things that he does, I think we also see a little bit of a lack of spine, a lack of backbone by the way that he reacts to the way that he is challenged. He should not have backed down. I mean, I teach 8th graders, and if they see you sweat, if they see fear in you on day one of school, you got a very long year ahead of you, right? I mean, if they challenge you on day one and you back down, that's not good. And Pilate is challenged and he backs down. Makes me wonder how things went for him after this. So he pronounces his judgment. I'm letting him go. That's my judgment. Oops, I went the wrong way. But the Sanhedrin won't stand for it. Verse 18 to 25, it says, "But they cried out all together, saying, 'Away with this man, and release for us Barabbas.' He was one who had been thrown into prison for a certain insurrection made in the city, and for murder." And Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept on calling out, saying, "Crucify him, crucify him." And he said to them the third time, "Why? What evil has this man done? I have found in him no guilt demanding death. I will therefore punish him and release him." But they were insistent with loud voices, asking that he be crucified, and their voices began to prevail. And Pilate pronounced sentence that their demand should be granted. And he released the man they were asking for, who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, but he delivered Jesus to their will. You know, Luke doesn't tell the story the exact same way that the other gospel writers tell the story, and that's fine. But one of the things that the other gospel writers say is that Pilate, when he hatches this plan, he specifically names Barabbas. And he says, "Look, would you rather me release Jesus or release Barabbas?" Well, Pilate, in his way of thinking, can't imagine that they would choose Barabbas, because Barabbas is a murderer. He is obviously guilty. He has led insurrections in the city. Barabbas he's Jack the Ripper. I mean, he is a bad guy. And Jesus, in Pilate's estimation, has done no wrong, has done nothing worthy of guilt. And so Pilate throws them a softball. He gives them a choice that he thinks is an obvious no-brainer, that they must choose to release Jesus and they must choose to crucify Barabbas. But we should never underestimate the power of a crowd to lead itself astray. And that's exactly what the crowd has done here. They demand the release of Barabbas. They cry, "Crucify him, crucify him." And again, Pilate asks the question, what evil has he done? Why? Why do you hate this man so much? Why do you want to see him dead when he has done nothing deserving of death? But then the crowd begins to prevail, and we see Pilate's will begin to falter. We see his backbone begin to bend a little bit, and in order to keep the peace, he agrees to deliver to them Jesus. Ultimately, what Pilate has to do is keep there from being any problems in the region that he is governor over. If there are problems in the region where he is governor, Caesar will get rid of him and replace him with somebody that can keep the peace. And so when it comes down to it, Pilate is willing to sacrifice the life of an innocent man to keep the peace so that he doesn't have to answer to Caesar. And so he delivers Jesus over to their will, regardless of the fact that their will is evil. And he is complicit in every sense of the word in the death of Jesus. In other gospel accounts, he tries to relieve himself of that complicity, relieve himself of that guilt by washing his hands of the matter, but he had the power to deliver and he chose not to. He had the power to do the right thing and he chose to do the wrong thing. So Pilate is complicit in Jesus' death. Verses 26 to 33. "And when they led him away, they laid hold of one Simon of Cyrene, coming in from the country, and placed on him the cross to carry behind Jesus. And there were following him a great multitude of people and of women who were mourning and lamenting him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, 'Daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren and the wombs that have never borne, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do the things in the green tree, what will happen in the dry?' And two others also, who were criminals, were being led away to be put to death with him. And when they came to the place called the Skull, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on the right and the other on the left. So Simon of Cyrene is chosen from the crowd. When Jesus falters under the load, he's chosen to be brought out and carry the cross for Jesus. And there are others who are following behind, mourning and weeping. The women are specifically mentioned, and we've talked at other times about the lengths that Luke goes to portray the women in a good sense in his gospel. There are stories about the women and the interactions that Jesus has with women that are absent from the other gospels, and Luke really highlights those positive interactions and the positive viewpoint of the way that the women responded to Jesus. But Jesus sees them mourning, and he, even in this midst of his being taken to his death, still finds himself as a teacher. And he addresses the women as they are mourning. Don't weep for me. Jesus is exactly where he's intended to be all along. Jesus is exactly where he wants to be. And he says, instead, weep for yourselves. Jesus had wept over Jerusalem on other occasions because he knew what the fate of Jerusalem was going to be. He knew what was going to happen to this beautiful city. He knew what was going to happen to the temple. He knew what was going to happen to those that were left behind in the city. And he says, weep for yourselves, because the fate of those that are caught up in the terrors that are to come are in worse shape than I am. Those that are left behind would pray that the mountains would fall on them. There he quotes from Hosea 8:10. See how fast I can find that. This is like, it takes me back to my Bible class days when I was a kid, and we'd have a verse that we had to look up and see who could get there the fastest. Yes, there is a quotation, and it originates in Hosea, and it's quoted a couple of times in the New Testament, but there is a quotation of it in Revelation as well. The breaking of one of the seals or the trumpets or one of those things when destruction is taking place on the earth and they cry for the mountains to fall on them. That's good. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that one. Hosea 8:10 says, even though they hire allies among the nations, now I will gather them up and they will begin to diminish because the burden of the king of princes. That's Hosea 8:10, but that doesn't say anything about the mountains falling on them. Gary? 10:8, thank you. Gary sets me up like that sometimes. I'm blaming it on him. He made these slides. All right. When it is my desire, I will chastise them, and the peoples will be gathered against them when they're... What? 10:8? Oh, that was 10:10. 10:8. Okay, that was my fault, not Gary's. That was my fault. And also the high... See, I would have lost this one, by the way. We're talking about turning in the... I would have lost this race. And the high places of Avon, the sin of Israel, will be destroyed. Thorn and thistle will grow on the altars. Then they will say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. So even back in the days of Hosea, there's a prophecy that Jesus uses to demonstrate that it is going to be fulfilled in relation to the destruction of Jerusalem that was yet to come. Jesus there is crucified between two criminals, and we'll say more about that in just a moment, I think. But two criminals are crucified with him, and then they take him to the place called the Skull, and it is there that he is crucified. Verses 34 to 38 says, but Jesus was saying, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing, and they cast lots, dividing up his garments among themselves. And the people stood by looking on, and even the rulers were sneering at him, saying, he saved others, let him save himself, if this is the Christ of God, his chosen one. And the soldiers also mocked him, coming up to him, offering him sour wine, and saying, if you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. Now there was also an inscription above him, this is the King of the Jews. If you can imagine all that he's been through up to this point over the last 24 hours leading up to this, and yet his response is, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Remember, Jesus' mission, recorded in Luke 19:10, was to seek and to save the lost. And Jesus, when he saw the people that were calling for his death, when he saw the soldiers that nailed him to the cross, when he saw the religious leaders mocking him, when he saw all of those people who were there wishing for his death, he saw not enemies, but he saw lost. And that's the only distinction that Jesus sees. He sees saved and he sees lost, and his heart is for the lost, and he wants them to be saved. So he's praying even for those that are crucifying him, that they could be saved as well. There was a casting of lots and a dividing of his garments. And remember that robe that Herod put on him, that costly purple robe? One of the other gospel accounts said that they did not divide, that they didn't tear that up. They didn't want to destroy that because that was a nice garment, so they cast lots for it to see who would wear, who could win that. If you can imagine those Roman soldiers dressed in their military gear, and one of them wins that beautiful purple robe that Herod put on him, and it was then his souvenir from the crucifixion. He saved others, the religious leaders mocking him, saying he saved others, and we know that Jesus offered salvation to many others. He specifically did that from time to time to sort of stir up the religious leaders of the day anyway. But he would forgive sins, he would save people, and then they're saying, well, he saved others, but he can't save himself. That's therefore a sign of his weakness. The soldiers mocked Jesus. They offered him sour wine to deaden the pain. He refused to drink it, but it would not have tasted good. It would not have been refreshing, but it would have been had a pain deadening effect. What's that word I'm looking for? Anesthetic effect. That's it. All I could think of was antihistamine, and I knew that wasn't it. And it would have had an anesthetic effect, and he refused that. He would not partake of it because he didn't want his senses dulled. If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. I mean, he could have called one angel. You didn't even have to call an angel. He could have spoken the word himself. He could have called 10,000 angels, as the hymn says. To have that power and to be willing to suffer wrongly, in spite of having that power, that's the true definition of meekness. It's power under control, and he had all the power he needed to relieve the pain, to end the suffering, but he chose to do his Father's will instead, and that is meekness, the definition of it. The inscription on the placard that was placed there, this is the King of the Jews, and one of the other gospel accounts says that the religious leaders took offense at that Pilate had put that on there, and they said, Don't put on there, this is the King of the Jews. Put on there, he said this is the King of the Jews. And Pilate refused to change the inscription. I've written what I've written. Just a jab at them, saying, you forced me into this position. Now you got to reap the consequences of what's been done. The two criminals, said we'd get back to them in just a moment. It says, one of the criminals who were hanged there was hurling abuse at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other answered, rebuked him, and said, "Do you not even fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving what we deserve for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." And he was saying, "Jesus, remember me when you come in your kingdom." And he said to him, "Truly I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise." Again, there Jesus hanging on the cross, and yet he is looking for the opportunity to save the lost. One criminal is hurling abuse, mocking him along with the rest of the crowd, saying, if you have the power to save yourself, do it, but take us with you when you go. Don't leave us hanging here. But then the other criminal, "Do you not fear God?" Recognized Jesus for who he was, that he was God in the flesh. And that criminal said, uttered no truer words. We are guilty. We deserve the punishment we've been given. Any one of us could have been hanging there in his place, and any one of us would have had the need to say the same words he has said. We are all guilty. We all deserve the death that Jesus bore, but he has the power to save us. Yes. Right. Mm-hmm. Jesus had that power in the moment to be able to minister to that man's needs, and to answer the needs of the moment is exactly what Jesus had the power to do. And certainly we wouldn't take that we wouldn't take that power away from Jesus, that he had the ability and the right to do that. Verses 44 to 49. And it was now about the 6th hour, and darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour, the sun being obscured. The veil of the temple was torn in two, and Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last. Now when the centurion saw what had happened, he began praising God, saying, Certainly this man was innocent. And all the multitudes who came together for this spectacle, when they observed what had happened, began to return, beating their breasts. And all his acquaintances and the women who accompanied him from Galilee were standing at a distance, seeing these things. Darkness from the 6th hour until the 9th hour. If I'm not mistaken, that's from noon to 3 o'clock. I think the first hour of the day was 6 a.m. and noon would have been the 6th hour. So from noon until 3 o'clock, there was darkness, and not just a twilight darkness, but a darkness. The sun was hidden. The temple veil was torn in two, signifying that tearing apart of the barrier that kept man out of the presence of God. Jesus now had paid the price. He had become the mediator between God and men, and we now had access to the Father in a way that we had never had before that. And he says, Into thy hands I commit my spirit, a quotation there from Psalms, 31st Psalm, verse 5, I hope, says, Into thy hand I commit my spirit. Thou hast ransomed me, O Lord God of truth. So Jesus has his final words was quoting Scripture, which I think is fitting. An interesting thought there. The centurion saw what took place. The centurion was a leader of Roman soldiers. He was acquainted with death. He knew guilt. He knew how guilty men died. And this was not a guilty man. He knew it. He could tell by the way that Jesus comported himself in the final moments of his life, and he could sense that something different had happened here than he had ever witnessed before. And so that centurion praised God and said, Certainly this man was innocent. That's not how a guilty person dies. And so that's an outsider's testimony about the events that had taken place there. Sometimes we get caught up in this notion that everybody there was against Jesus, that the multitudes there were all crying out, Crucify him, crucify him. Jesus still had supporters. He still had people that believed in him. He still had people that were sad by what they had seen. And here we have reference to that. There were multitudes that were beating their breasts. There were multitudes that were distraught over what had happened. And then there were others who were closer, not just outsiders, not just multitudes that had witnessed these things, but there were his acquaintances, his people, his family, his mother, his brothers and sisters, his disciples, the women that had followed him in his ministry. A lot of them were gathered there, and they were seeing these things. And imagine the devastation that they were experiencing at seeing the death of their Lord. Wow. I mean, no more important chapter in the Bible than we could study than the story of the crucifixion. Verses 50 through 56 relate to us his burial. It says, Behold, a man named Joseph, who was a member of the council, a good and righteous man. He had not consented to their plan and action. A man from Arimathea, city of the Jews, who was waiting for the kingdom of God. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. And he took it down and he wrapped it in a linen cloth, and he laid him in a tomb cut into the rock where no one had ever lain. And it was the preparation day, and the Sabbath was about to begin. Now the women who had come with him out of Galilee followed after and saw the tomb and how his body was laid. They returned and prepared spices and perfumes, and on the Sabbath day they rested according to the commandment. So Joseph of Arimathea, who was a member of the council, he was a part of that Sanhedrin, that ruling body of the Jewish leadership, and he had not consented to the things that had taken place. He had not agreed to the trial. He had not agreed in the verdict. He had not been one of the ones shouting, "Crucify him." He had stood in opposition to the rest of that ruling body, or at least at least a majority portion of that ruling body. And he was waiting for the kingdom of God. He was faithfully searching the scriptures to see if Jesus fit the description of what the Messiah should be. And he believed that Jesus was the one. He went and asked Pilate for the body. He did not want to leave the body. It was against Jewish law, in fact, to leave a body on a cross through the Sabbath. So they needed to get that body removed from the cross before the Sabbath day began at nightfall. So if from noon to 3 it was dark, and at 3 Jesus breathed his last, then there's a short window of time from 3 o'clock to get the body down to get it to the tomb before nightfall happens, and they've entered into the Sabbath then. So Joseph of Arimathea has the body wrapped. He has it laid in a tomb where no one had ever lain. It was a new tomb. It had been hewn from the rock. It was not a natural cave even. It was a carved cave, if I remember right from other Gospels. The women that were following after Jesus, the women that were part of that ministry, watched, and they saw where he was laid, and they went and they prepared spices, and they got those things prepared before the Sabbath began, because once the Sabbath began, they could do no work, and they had those things prepared. They observed the Sabbath as faithful Jews would have done and rested according to the commandment, but had the things ready to go for as soon as they could at dawn on the first day of the week. And that gets us to chapter 24. We're going to get started into chapter 24 at least, if we don't get it finished. Chapter 24, verses 1 through 12. Says, "But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb bringing the spices which they had prepared, and they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were perplexed about this, behold, 2 men suddenly stood near them in dazzling clothing. And as the women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said to them, 'Why do you seek the living one among the dead? He is not here, but he is risen. Remember how he spoke to you while he was still in Galilee, saying, the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and the third day rise again.' And they remembered his words and returned from the tomb and reported all these things to the 11 and all the rest. Now they were Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James, also the other women with them were telling these things to the apostles. But these words appeared to them as nonsense, and they would not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb, stooping, and looking in, he saw the linen wrappings only. And he went away to his home, marveling at what had happened." It was the first day of the week. So Jesus is crucified on Friday, laid in the tomb Friday evening before the Sabbath begins at sundown. He stays in the tomb through Saturday, and then by early morning hours, dawn of Sunday, the third day that he has been in the tomb, the first day of the week, he is resurrected. So when the women get to the tomb, they're taking those spices, those things that they had taken to minister to the body of Jesus, where they had seen him laid, where they had seen his dead body taken. They had seen it wrapped. They had seen it placed in the tomb. They had seen the stone laid there. They got there, and the stone was rolled away. The women were wondering, how did this happen? Why is the stone not there? Where is the body? What has taken place? They're questioning. When suddenly there are 2 men in dazzling clothes, and you could imagine, we've seen, Jesus when he was in his glorified state, he shone bright like the sun. We've seen other occasions when Moses spoke with God face to face, his face shone like the sun. And so these heavenly beings, these angelic beings, they sparkle, they shine. And the women noticed that about them. And they call to mind, remember how he spoke. Remember what he told you when he was in Galilee, that he must go to Jerusalem. There he would fall victim to sinful men, and he would be crucified, and he would lay in the tomb for 3 days, and he would be raised again. You heard him say those things. Why are you surprised when you come to the tomb on the third day and he is gone? Why would you expect him to be here? And so they call to mind those things that Jesus had taught them. So the women take this message back to the 11, and the 11 say, "Yay, Jesus is risen." Just checking. No, they say, "You're talking gibberish. This is foolishness. We saw him dead. We saw him crucified. We know that he's in the tomb. We saw him laid there. How can you come to us with this story about him being raised from the dead when we plainly saw him die? Yeah. Right. Hindsight. Yeah. Yeah. It is okay. It is okay for us to learn in retrospect sometimes. And so there's a moment of that aha moment when, oh, that's what he meant. That's where all this was leading. Now we understand it. We're going to see a lot of those moments as we read through the remainder of Luke and then even on into the book of Acts. We're going to see a lot of those kind of aha moments take place. But the 11 were skeptical, and Peter even runs to the tomb. Other gospel accounts say that John ran with him. Peter got there first but stopped at the entrance. John ran on into the tomb, or maybe I can't remember now, maybe it's vice versa. But, they get there and they see that, yeah, he's gone. He's not there. I wonder where he's at, because he's not here. And so they are perplexed at this point, to say the least. Verses 13 to 27, and behold, two of them were going that very day to a village named, I've always said it Emmaus, but I always heard Gary say it Emmaus. So he probably knows more than I do. So we'll say Emmaus. They were going to a village named Emmaus, which was about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they were talking with each other about all these things which had taken place. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself approached and began traveling with them. But their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are these words that you are exchanging with one another as you are walking?" And they stood still, looking sad. One of them, named Cleopas, answered and said to him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem and unaware of the things which have happened here in these days?" And he said to them, "What things?" And they said to him, "These things about Jesus the Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word in the sight of God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to the sentence of death and crucified him. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, besides all this, it is the third day since these things happened. But also some women among us amazed us when they were at the tomb early in the morning and did not find his body. They came saying that they had also seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just exactly as the women also had said, but him they did not see." And he said to them, "O foolish men, and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and with all the prophets, he explained to them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. So 2 disciples traveling to Emmaus, and they're leaving Jerusalem that day, and they've been in Jerusalem for the observance of the Passover that had taken place earlier that week. And now it's the first day of the week, and they are headed back to their homes. They've got to resume their lives. It's no longer, time for them to be spending that time in Jerusalem. So they're headed back home. And they're talking about all the things that have taken place. They are just talking about the current events, as you would imagine that you might be doing if you were traveling with a friend. And Jesus approached them to walk with them. And I like that it says they were prevented from recognizing who he was. I think we have enough information here to determine that these two men have been following Jesus from the beginning. They are faithful followers of Jesus. These are not newcomers. These are not novices when it comes to the things that have been taking place. I think they were disciples. They were followers of Jesus. And so it's only through something miraculous taking place that they don't recognize who Jesus is. They fill Jesus in with their understanding of the things that have taken place, and they give a very faithful accounting of the things that have taken place. They give a very good synopsis of the events that have happened up to that point. And then they said, kind of that pivotal thing, we were hoping that he was the one. We were hoping that he was the one that would redeem Israel, revealing that they are thinking physically, because he is the one to redeem Israel. He just did what he had to do to redeem Israel. And yet they still think that it's been a failure, that it's been a mistake that's taken place, when really everything that has happened has been exactly as Jesus told them it would happen. It's been an exact fulfillment of God's will. And so they just demonstrate their lack of understanding. And Jesus here chastises them. And he chastises them for their lack of understanding. How could you not see? How could you not understand that this is what needed to take place? And Jesus there, it says, he began with Moses. And Moses, not the life of Moses, but the writings of Moses. He begins with Genesis. He begins with the scheme of redemption laid forth in Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3. When God creates the world falls due to sin, and God promises that he is going to send a Redeemer even in the Garden of Eden. I think that's where Jesus started. He started with the writings of Moses, and he delivered to them an accounting of how is it that Jesus was the one who was supposed to come. Johnny. Right? Yeah. Oh, can you imagine? So from Jerusalem to Emmaus is about 7 miles. So that's walking at a good clip, 2 hours. Walking at a leisurely pace, maybe 3. And so for 2 to 3 hours, Jesus, the first part of this conversation happens as they meet up just outside the gate of Jerusalem, and they're walking along, and very quickly Jesus launches into his, and for the next 2 or 3 hours, they listen to Jesus expound upon the Scriptures. Don't you wish you could have been one of them? It would have been great. So he explained to them how Jesus really was the one to redeem Israel. And they still don't know that he's Jesus yet. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and these men were disciples. They had been listening to Jesus for the last 3 years. They had heard Jesus explain from the Scriptures all the way back to Moses before this day already that he was the one. And Jesus is willing to say, okay, you guys have heard this before. I'm going to explain it one more time, and maybe this time it'll click. Maybe this time it'll sink in. Maybe this time you'll understand how I really am the one that Moses has been writing about and all the other prophets. And so you're exactly right. We need to hear it continually. We need constant reminders about who Jesus is and what he came to do. And so I appreciate that. The next section here is they approached the village where they were going. He acted, that is, Jesus acted as though he were going farther. But they urged him, saying, "Stay with us, for it is getting toward evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. And when he had reclined at the table with them, he took the bread and blessed it, and breaking it, and he began giving it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to one another, Were not our hearts burning within us while he was speaking it to us on the road, while he was explaining the Scriptures to us? And they got up that very hour and returned to Jerusalem, and found gathered together the 11 and those who were with them, saying, "The Lord has really risen and has appeared to Simon." They began to relate their experiences on the road and how he was recognized by them in the breaking of the bread. So as they approach the village, Jesus acts like, "Well, it was good talking to you guys. I've got to go on further." And they're like, no, stay with us, because it's almost dark. It's getting late. We want you to come, and we want to continue hearing what you have to say. We want to hear more about your understanding of the Scriptures. And so they prevail upon Jesus to go and lodge with them. So Jesus goes to their house and lodges with them, and then he reclines at the table with them. And so this may have been a familiar scene for them if they were gathered with the disciples. We think of the disciples, the 12, being with Jesus in that upper room. It seems like they recognize Jesus in the moment when he begins distributing the bread, and when he begins participating in some of the things that have just taken place a few days before that. And they're like, wait a minute, we've seen this guy do this before. We've seen this guy distribute the bread before. They understood who he was at that time. And so he blessed and broke the bread, and in that action, in that time, they recognize who he is. And as soon as they recognize him, he vanishes. Oh, can you imagine? You see him, it dawns on you who he is, and you're just about to hug him, you're just about to exclaim, you're just about to whatever, and then he's gone. Oh, that would have been almost too much to bear, that he was gone after just realizing who he was. But then, do you imagine that it was a little quicker return to Jerusalem than it had been leaving Jerusalem to get to Emmaus? I wonder if they made it in, maybe in less than 2 hours then, or whatever. I don't know. Clint, how fast can you run 7 miles? Not very fast. About an hour? Oh, man, that's way faster than me. But they recognized, and they left that minute to return to Jerusalem. And there they knew where to find the 11. This is another indicator to me that they were part of that group, that they were faithful disciples, that they had been with Jesus often enough that they knew where to go to find where the 11 were gathered at this time. So they found the 11 and others that were gathered there with them. They heard the story then at that point of Jesus having appeared to Simon, because we know from other gospel accounts that on the first day that Jesus doesn't appear just to these two men, but he makes other appearances as well. So Peter has already related to the group, I've seen Jesus. He really is back. He really is alive. I've seen him. And then these two men are able to add to the story and say, yes, we've seen him too, and we recognized him when he broke the bread and he distributed it. Remember how he did that here with us? We saw him do that very thing. We know it's him. And so they're able to relate that story of what they had experienced. So I think we'll stop right there. We'll finish up Luke chapter 24 and begin with the book of Acts as well next week. So let's see, verse 36. Okay, so then we'll pick up there and do Acts chapter 1 as well next week probably. Any other thoughts or comments before we close out our study for tonight? Greg? Say that again. Yeah. Okay, so from other gospel accounts, we know that Luke doesn't give us everything. So from other gospel accounts, we know that Jesus did appear to Peter independently on that first day when he was raised. And so Peter has told this story at that point, and they're corroborating it. They're saying, we believe it. We believe that he appeared to Peter because we have a story to tell as well, and he has appeared to us. So it's not just one person saying it and then everybody's sitting there thinking, wow, is he making that up? Well, no, he's not making it up. We have a story to tell too. So, so there are the timeline of events of things that take place, well, all through the ministry of Jesus. There's, we've talked before about Luke kind of clumping things together. Luke is a faithful historian. But he's not a historian like we are historians. When we think of histories or things, we are very beholden to chronology in our telling of a history. Luke is more about making his case for what he's trying to say. And so sometimes he clumps things together that aren't necessarily chronological. And we see that very quickly with at the end of the chapter when we get there, verse 49 is something that's still taking place on day one. That's the first day of the week. Everything that happens down through verse 49 is happening on that first day of the week when Jesus is raised. I think, if I remember my notes right. I think that's right. Because Jesus appears in this group as they are gathered there at that time. And so we have these men. Peter has said, I saw Jesus. These men say, we believe that he saw Jesus because we saw Jesus too. And after they tell their story, guess who shows up? Jesus is there. And he's in that room with them through verse 49. But then verse 50, they're heading out to Bethany for the ascension. Well, 7 weeks take place before that happens, right? So Luke doesn't always present things in a strictly chronological fashion. But he presents things in a way that make the case for what he's doing in a faithfully historical sense. So that's that thought. There are other appearances scattered all throughout those 7 weeks that Luke doesn't talk about. Okay, Thank you.